Hello, and welcome to this demonstration of the FTP commands that are included with the CoolSpools application. So FTP, as I'm sure you know, has been an industry standard method of sharing documents between file servers for over 50 years now. The IBM I or AS400 server does contain some basic FTP capabilities within its operating system, but these are geared largely towards interactive FTP sessions and are not straightforward to integrate into your applications. The latest version of CoolSpools includes 4 FTP commands that help simplify delivery of your FTP requirements. FTPPOUT puts or sends a file from your IBM I server to a remote FTP server. FTPGET receives or gets a file from the remote FTP server to your IBM I. FTPDelete deletes a file from a remote FTP server. And FTPDIR generates a directory listing of the files that exist within a directory on a remote FTP server. Now, all of these commands are dependent on the permissions on the remote server, so you can rest assured that you won't be able to delete a file from the remote file server unless you're connecting with user credentials that have permission to do so. Now, each of these commands is useful in its own right, but really they come into their own when they're used in combination. Let's imagine a scenario where we have a third party or an external system delivering sales orders in the form of text files that are dropped into a network file server or a cloud server. What we need to do is get those sales orders into our IBM I application database. And we can do that by running the CoolSpools command FTPDIR to get a listing of all of the order files that currently exist on the remote server. We can then loop through the list and run the command FTPGET for each entry in the list to retrieve the order file to our IBM I server. We'll then need to run some sort of process to extract the data into our database, and finally we can run FTPDelete to delete the file from the remote file server once we're happy that it's been loaded into our database. So now let's log on to our IBM I server in order to have a look at those FTP commands. FTPPOUT, if we F4 to prompt that, has a fairly straightforward set of parameters. We need to specify the local path of the file that we want to send, the name of the remote FTP server, the path on the remote server where we want to deliver our file, and the username and password that we want to use to connect to that remote server. There are other parameters to control whether we use an open or secure FTP connection. FTPGET has a very similar set of parameters. Again, we need to specify the remote path of the file that we want to retrieve and the local path where we want the file to be placed. FTPDelete also has a similar set of parameters, although we don't need to specify a local path this time, just the connection details to the remote server and the path of the file that we want to delete from the remote server. And finally, we come to the FTPDIR command. Now, this has a few additional parameters. So while we still need to specify the name and logon details for the remote FTP server and the path on the remote server of the directory that we want to generate the directory listing for, we also need to specify the name of a local database file where we want to place the results of the directory listing. This would typically be a temporary work file, and it's populated with a standard set of columns, including the file name, owner, size, and last change date. And we also have the option to include files from subdirectories within the directory listing. By default, only files directly under the named directory will be included. Now, let's look at a CL program that combines the FTPDIR and FTPGET commands, very much like the sales order example we saw earlier. So this CL program starts by defining a couple of variables and a database file named cs_FTPDIR. This file, which is included in the CoolSpools product, contains the standard layout for the FTPDIR output. We then delete a work file from Qtemp if it already exists, before running the FTPDIR command to get a listing of order files from a remote server, placing the results into a work file, work_dir out in library Qtemp. And you may have noticed that when we specified the path on the remote server, we included a wildcard to only pick up files with an extension of .ord. And in the other parameters, we've specified the name of the remote system and the user ID and password that we're going to use to connect. Now, having run the FTPDIR command, we override from the CS FTPDIR file to our temporary file in Qtemp, and we do this because the temporary file will have been created with the standard file layout, and by using the standard file name and overriding to it, we can compile our CL program without having to physically create the file in Qtemp at compile time. Next, the program starts a loop, reading each of the entries in our file listing from Qtemp. I mentioned earlier that one of the fields in the standard FTPDIR output is the remote file size, and in this case the program is excluding or skipping over any files with a size of 0, so empty files are not loaded by this process. Next, we populate a couple of variables with the full remote path name and local path name of the file, so it's been copied to a local directory on the IFS named /sales/orders. And then we run the FTPGET command in order to get the file from the remote file server to our local directory on the IFS. Now, once we've received the file onto the IFS, we need to run some sort of process in order to extract the data from that file. There are a number of CoolSpools commands that you could use in order to run that extraction. So if the file is an Excel spreadsheet, you can use the impxldbf command. If the file is a CSV or some other type of delimited file, then you can use the impcsvdbf command. If it's a file with data in fixed positions but without delimiters, then you can use the impfxddbf command, and that can be used with files that have multiple record types with a record type ID in the first few characters. And if the file is an XML document, then you can use the impxmldbf command. Or you may have your own custom processes that you want to run in order to extract the data from the text file. Once we've loaded the data from the received text file into our database, then we may want to run the FTPDelete command to remove the file from the remote file server. Next, the program returns to the start of the loop in order to process the next file from the list. And once all of the files have been processed, the program will jump out of the loop and delete the override of CS FTPDIR and delete the work file from Qtemp. And you'll be pleased to know that this source member, FTP example, can be found on your server as part of the CoolSpools product if you've installed the latest version of CoolSpools version 7. It can be found in the source file cs_source file in library CoolSPv7R1. I hope that that's been a useful introduction to the FTP commands included with CoolSpools. You can find more information about all of the commands that we've looked at in this video, plus the rest of the CoolSpools application at our website www.coolspools.com.